It's really good to be with you this morning, although of course it would have been much better to have been with you in person than remotely. What a strange time we are in, and we continue to pray for our NHS, all those suffering from coronavirus, and those involved in the research, distribution and delivery of vaccinations. None of us this time last year would have predicted that we would be here now. I'm delighted that you are following through the first letter of Peter. This week's theme is a chosen people. There's a great deal of misunderstanding about the nature of the church today, primarily because people think it's about buildings and all that happens in those buildings, rather than something more. The last year has therefore challenged us, and perhaps challenged the world, that the church can effectively exist outside its buildings. Today we look at Peter's analysis of the church, what it is, what its foundation should be, and what it is called to do. Peter is uniquely qualified to talk about the church. He was the speaker of the great confession which Jesus says was the foundation upon which he would build his church. He was unquestionably the leader of the first century church. He was an inspired apostle, and therefore it is good to give heed to his words. So firstly, Peter's word on the nature of the church. It is a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, and a unique community. It is a spiritual house composed of living stones. God is not building with bricks and mortar and plaster and steel. He is building with living stones. We are the church. We are the house of God. God lives in the hearts of people. Buildings are important, but buildings are mere tools for the church of God. We ourselves are God's house. However, we are not only a spiritual house, we are a holy priesthood too. Everyone who acknowledges Jesus Christ as Lord is a member of this priesthood. The scripture tells us that we are priests, meaning that unlike the Old Testament function of the priest, we all have access to God. When we have need for wisdom or strength, when we are pressured, when we are in distress, whatever our need is, we can go directly into God's presence. Peter also tells us that we are a unique community. We are a chosen race with a common origin in God. We are a nation, we're a people, we're a priesthood, we are one, we're a unit. The New Testament seldom refers to individual Christians. It almost always speaks of individuals in community. And all biblical pictures of the church stress the fact that we are one. All distinctions break down, all differences set aside, as it is Christ that draws us together. This is something that the world is desperately looking for, but people so seldom find. And at the end of this week of prayer for Christian unity, it's good to be reminded of this calling, for there to be spiritual unity among us, not only within our churches, but across our churches too. I wonder how many of us have ever said the words, "Who me?" Perhaps we've been chosen to do something, perhaps we've been asked to do something we never thought ourselves capable of by someone else. We can think they've got it wrong, they can't mean me, can they? The amazing thing about the Christian faith, though, is God's call in each of our lives. As Peter in these verses tells us, each of us is chosen, called to be royal and holy. Each of us is God's person. And of course we can reply to that, "Who me?" And God replies to each of us, "Yes, you." Peter's letter is a wonderful reminder to us of who we are and what we should be. The choosing of us wasn't anything to do with merit or age or devotion or family background, but purely because God loves us and wants us to respond to that love and be his church. And for those who know what it's like not to be chosen, we are encouraged here because it says that God chooses us, that we are special and required by God. that our gifts count for something, that regardless of all our faults, there is something about each of us that God likes and wants. And Peter's letter goes on to remind us that not only are we chosen, but we have a responsibility to live as those who have responded to his higher calling. Secondly, he has something to say about the foundation of the church. Come to me, and like living stones, be yourselves built into a spiritual house. That's how we are built into that spiritual house. We come to the Lord, and that's just the beginning. It's Christ's desire to make us like him. He is a living stone, and he wants us to be living stones too. I lived in Yorkshire for a number of years and always admired the thousands of miles of dry stone walls that were all around the countryside. It amazed me that they were built so well, although nothing held the stones together like mortar or cement. They hardly ever collapsed and withstood all kinds of weather. Looking carefully at a dry stone wall, you can see how important each stone is, some large and some small, but each of them supporting one another. As a child, I used to walk too along the seashore with my mother and admiring the stones shining as the sea washed over them. Worn stones, all different colours and all different sizes with all different stories, many simply beautiful. And in Peter's letter we read that we are precious in God's sight, not only living stones, but precious stones too. We often think of precious stones as those which are rare or polished or placed in crown jewels or a museum cabinet, but to God we are all precious stones, beautiful and infinitely priceless. Peter goes on though, and as precious stones we are instructed to be living and to allow ourselves to be built into a spiritual house. That excites me because, like a dry stone wall, each of us needs the help of those around us. You cannot build anything with only one stone. All of us are required to come together to create something spiritual. That means that those brought together by God need to talk to one another about spiritual things. We must pray together, worship together, and work together. It means doing things together. It's impossible to read this passage without remembering Jesus' words to Peter in the book of Matthew. After Peter had declared who Jesus was, Jesus said, "And I tell you that you are Peter." The Greek word for Peter means a loose rock. And on this rock, he uses here a different Greek word which means a solid, immovable ledge, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Jesus was saying, Peter, it's upon this rock, upon this person who recognises Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, that I will build my church. We begin as a loose pile of stone, but we come to Jesus and he takes our life and begins to change it into the character of a solid rock. And it is upon that basis that the church is built. That has been happening since that day onwards, regardless of what has happened in the world, in times of hardship and times of plenty, in centuries of war and in centuries of peace, in times of pandemic like this one, which is why each of us is important now, why what we do as a church counts, and why God continues to need us to build his church into the future. Finally, Peter speaks of the function of the church. It's to do two things. Firstly, we're to offer up spiritual sacrifices, everything we have to God, putting him first in all things. Jesus teaches that true life consists of giving up, of yielding up our rights, everything we are and have to be used and shaped by him. To say first and foremost, God, what do you want from me? And how would you like me to use what I have been given? The second function of the church is to declare God's deeds. We've been called into the light not because we're people who have made it, but as someone once said, because we're people who can't make it on our own. God has called us, and we are to share what God has done, the good news of Jesus Christ, in the same way as people have shared the message since the time of the early church. And it's a privilege to belong to God's church, however, it's also a responsibility. Our witness is more than our presence. We are to proclaim, to share, to speak of all that God has done. On the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, there is part of the temple that has survived the destruction by the Romans in 70 AD, and 2,000 years of turbulent history since. The large stones are up to 12 metres in length by 2.4 metres in size. They weigh 80 tonnes each. The sheer size and weight of the stones help stabilise the structure, and each stone is carefully chosen so there are no faults and cracks that would build a weakness into the wall. We can imagine these stones. We can reflect that this is the foundation on which our faith is built. Jesus Christ, our cornerstone. And if we rest on him, we can depend on his strength. So as we continue to be the church in these difficult times outside our building, each of us is challenged today to be Christ's living stones, shining for him, working for him, sharing together, bearing witness to the mighty deeds of God. So others come to discover that they too are precious and loved. Who, me? Yes, you.